We're going to talk about privacy risk today, and I've got four kind of quick areas to talk about, and then we'll have opportunity for discussion. I thought I had the chat up, but I don't see it now, and I don't want to spend too much time finding it. So, Isabel, if somebody puts a good question in chat, bring my attention to it. So we're going to talk about why we measure privacy risk, or why you should think about measuring it. What is risk for those who may not be familiar in depth, at least with the concept? What is privacy risk as opposed to just risk in general? And then I'll discuss a couple of different privacy risk models. So why measure privacy risk? So one is to prioritize risk mitigation efforts. So if you're having a large corporation and you've got a lot of things going on, you can't address every potential issue. You need to prioritize. And measuring privacy risk helps you identify high-risk areas that you need to prioritize over low-risk areas. One thing in particular, NIST, which is the U.S. National Institute of Standards, recently, February, March of 2020, published their initial privacy framework, and it is a framework for companies or organizations to build their privacy programs around, and it is very risk-centric. Now, it is also risk model neutral, so they don't tell you how to calculate or how to assess risk, but they tell you you should be using privacy risk analysis to prioritize your efforts within the privacy framework. So prioritization efforts are important. The second is to fit within acceptable tolerance levels. So an organization should develop its own tolerance for how much risk it can or will accept. And so you want to be able to measure it somehow and say, okay, this risk is outside or within acceptable limits. Kind of making the analogy to the auto industry, cars kill people, right? And you can't make a car perfectly safe. So, as much as we would like to say that, and we want to continue to improve safety, we have to have an acceptable level of accidents, injury, and even death. And this is an unfortunate thing. I talk to a lot of companies and I'm like, okay, we need to set some acceptable levels. And they're like, we want zero privacy violations. We want no harm. And I'm like, that's not realistic if you want to actually put out a product or service. So finding those acceptable tolerance levels. Now, I will say there is no good way at present. Nobody has really established a good way of determining kind of an acceptable tolerance level. In the auto industry, they tend to translate lives and injuries into dollars and cents because of what they might be sued for. It seems a very cold and calculated thing, and it's also privacy being a little bit more ambiguous. It's a lot harder to translate that directly into dollars and financial figures. But we should still consider looking at acceptable tolerance levels. And then, of course, there's the old backup of complying with laws and regulations. Maybe familiar with Article 25 under the GDPR, which is data protection by design and default. And I just finished reading an interesting article by law professor R.E. Waldman, where he talks about how Article 25 has practically no meaning, that it basically says do the rest of the stuff in GDPR. I will say one thing, and I've highlighted here, it does talk about, looking at the risk of varying likelihoods and severities for rights and freedoms. So it does mention risk assessment or looking at risk, whereas the rest of GDPR is more prescriptive and doesn't talk about doing any sorts of balancing of risk. So those are some reasons to try to look at privacy risk. So what is risk in general? And there's a lot of definitions out there. So this is by no means an authoritative definition, but we can think about risk as one, a possible consequence. Now I say possible because if it's a known consequence, then it's a cost. If I know next year as a result of me doing something, I'm going to have to pay $100. That's a cost, not a risk. If there's a possibility that I have to pay $100, that's a risk because it's a possible consequence as a result of my action. So we can also think about this in terms of, so it's the likelihood of something happening resulting in a consequence. So it's not just it may or may not happen, but how likely is it? Is it really likely? Is it not very likely? So we have to have some measurement of how likely it is that it will happen. So this is one definition that has been used for security, information security for a while. I don't know if it's an official definition of NIST or not, but I've heard it repeated ad nauseum, and that is the likelihood of a threat exploiting a vulnerability and resulting in adverse consequences. Okay, easy to understand from potentially a security perspective. How likely is a threat, an outside hacker, a system failing, an internal employee getting access to information, exploiting some kind of vulnerability? And again, it can be a security vulnerability. It could be a vulnerability like this hard drive is old and it's going to fail and we're going to lose data integrity, resulting in some adverse consequence. So what is the risk of this happening? So looking at this and kind of parsing it out, the three important elements: threats, vulnerabilities, and consequences. Which one of these can we apply privacy to? Is privacy a threat? Is privacy a vulnerability? Or is it a consequence? And I would submit it's the latter, that privacy is a consequence of something happening. It's what we call an invasion of privacy or a privacy harm. As a result of me being given access to a camera, I am watching you. That is the privacy harm, that my surveillance or monitoring of you. I'm exploiting a vulnerability of access to your camera. I am the threat actor, and the consequence is you are being monitored or surveilled. Now, again, GDPR talks about likelihood and severity. So likelihood applies to the threat and the vulnerability. How likely is it that the threat exploits the vulnerability? And then to severity, how severe are the consequences? Now, I'm going to go through 4 different models of privacy harms, privacy risks. I should have, these are the privacy harms that 4 different models of privacy risk use. Sorry for that little flub there, but and talk to you about this now. The first one I want to present is fair privacy. That is one that I promote in my book, and that I'm currently working on a paper with another co-author to submit to a conference. And we use the Solov taxonomy of privacy, where Dan Solov, who's a professor of law at George Washington University, breaks privacy into 4 categories and ultimately 16 different privacy harms. Now, the actual fair privacy model is agnostic. You could use a different model of privacy norms. For instance, Kalo's objective subjective harms, Herzog's 3 pillars of privacy, Weston states of privacy. You could use all sorts of different models if you wanted to. We just happen to use Solov because it's discrete enough. There's 6. It's not as ambiguous as some of the others that try to put privacy into much smaller buckets. Now, the Kaulufa method, which is very similar, it uses a basis in FAIR, which is also which is a security risk model, factors analysis and information risk. They look at the privacy harms. Now, the paper that describes this method is not explicit. It doesn't say you, similar to the way fair privacy does, it doesn't say you have to use these particular ones, but it does discuss what it calls the hard privacy of linkability, identifiability, detectability, and disclosure of information. And this is part of the Linden threat model. Now, I should point out that these are things that these privacy risk models are trying to avoid. These are these adverse consequences that we don't want to happen. So under fair privacy, we don't want exclusion. We don't want secondary use. Under the Kaulufa method, we don't want linkability. We don't want identifiability. We don't want detectability, etc. Now, NIST has its own. Again, the NIST privacy framework mentions this, but it doesn't necessarily say you have to use this. And they refer to these things that you're trying to avoid as problematic data actions: appropriation, distortion, induced disclosure, insecurity. And you'll notice that a lot of these are very similar to the Solov taxonomy. Appropriation is one of the items. Although I'm not seeing it in my list over there. If I'm missing it, I might be short one. Distortion, disclosure, insecurity, surveillance. So very similar. They took a mismatch of Solov and FIPS, which is the Fair Information Practice Principles, to come up with their problematic data actions. Now, the fourth model I want to mention is the Keneal method, and they have feared events. So these are events that you're trying to, again, avoid: unavailability of legal processes, change in processing, illegitimate access to personal data, unwanted change in personal data, disappearance of personal data. And as Isabel pointed out when we were going through this, it's based in part on the ISO 29100 and 3300 privacy standards. Now, I want to point out these are not the only privacy risk models that are out there. And they're kind of a historical basis. A lot of the older models for privacy risk were really very organizational focused. In other words, what is a risk to the organization? Reputation, fines, regulatory action, lawsuits, internal costs from dealing with data breaches. These newer models that I'm presenting here all focus on risk to the individual, the risk of secondary use, of exclusion, the risk of linkability, the risk of appropriation and distortion, the risk that the individual suffers unavailability of legal processes. So they're very focused on that. Now, NIST still has it, even though it looks from a adverse effective of individual action, it still looks at it from an organization perspective, and we'll get into that here in a second. So now let's look at the four models in terms of, remember, there's likelihood and severity. So how does fair privacy measure likelihood? There are four component factors that go into that. Opportunity. What is the opportunity of the threat actor to do this action or exploit this vulnerability that results in this consequence? What is the motivation of that threat actor? Are they highly motivated? Are they not motivated much at all? What are the motivations? Now, to be fair, not every threat actor is going to have the same motivation. So let's say you're concerned about, social media users doing something to other social media users. Some of them, if you have some stalker trying to stalk somebody, they're going to be highly motivated, whereas the average person is probably not going to be motivated much. So there's going to be variance among the population of threat actors and against the population of potential at-risk individuals. So both fair privacy and the Kaulufa method, take this kind of variance into effect by using simulation. So they do what's called Monte Carlo simulation, where they simulate, well, here's a whole bunch of threat actors, and here's a whole bunch of random variables in terms of their motivations or opportunity. How does that play out in terms of the likelihood of this happening? The third factor in fair privacy is threat actor capability. So this isn't so there's a difference between capacity and capability. Capacity is that opportunity. If I give you data, now you have the capacity. Capability is Do you know what to do with it? If it's a wealth of data, do you have access to a supercomputer to analyze it? Do you have a data scientist on hand? If I gave a data dump of millions of records to a florist, they can't do much with it. If I gave it to Google, they could send it over to one of their interns who's, getting a CS degree, PhD. So they have a lot more capabilities. Then the difficulty of impediment. How difficult have I made it for this threat actor to do something? Am I giving them plain text or am I giving them encrypted data? Is it abstracted such that it's I'm only giving data that's grouped by groups of people. I'm not giving them individual data. Anyway, those are the four factors. The Kaulufa method is very similar. Contact frequency, which is very similar to opportunity. Probability of action, which pulls from the original FAIR, factors, analysis, and information risk, uses probability of action. We just, in FAIR privacy, we just called that motivation. Again, threat actor capability, same things. Difficulty becomes strength of external threat actors or countermeasures bypass, and those are for internal threat actors. And then because this method is very data-centric, they also talk about retention periods. So the longer you have data, the more likely that somebody is to do this. Now, NIST measures likelihood on a 10-point ordinal scale. So basically, you're supposed to go in, and it's a fairly subjective methodology, and say, okay, this is a 7, this is a 6, this is a 10. Figuring out some type of ordinal scale such that 3 is higher than 2, 4 is higher than all of those. It doesn't really talk about the variance between the ordinals. It just points it out that it's greater than or less than some other measurement. Similarly, Keneal's method uses a 4-point scale of negligent, limited, significant, and maximum. Now, one of the things they do for each of their privacy harms that was mentioned in the previous slide, they kind of give some guidance. What does it mean to be negligible? What does it mean to have a limited likelihood, significant, maximum? My concern about the last two methods, again, it doesn't really play in for variance. What if you have 1 million threat actors and for 999,000 of them, they have a negligible likelihood of doing something, but then the other 1,000 have a maximum likelihood. They're really, motivated to do this. Does that mean that the overall risk is negligible or maximum or somewhere in between? So unfortunately, what happens with a lot of these ordinal scale measurements is you end up getting a lot of medium risk. Everything becomes medium risk because it all kind of gets bundled down and there's no variation to understand where things are. Okay, moving on to severity. So under fair privacy, we look at two factors: the non-normativity of the activity. In other words, how severe is it against social norms? So if I were to use secondary information from the people attending this event to reach out on LinkedIn and say, hey, thanks for attending my event. If you want to connect, please connect with me. Okay, that wasn't the intent of your names being shared with me. It's a secondary use, but it's probably not that bad. If I were to take this information, add you to my email list, go ahead and invite a connection, not just try to initiate a message to you. If I were to, post your name on my website and say, look at all these great people that attended my event. That would be a little bit more from a perspective of normativity, off the chains in terms of it's not as appropriate. So I base or fair privacy bases this measurement of non-normativity on 3 factors: awareness of what's happening or going to happen, how much does the individual benefit, and then to what degree did they consent? Are they aware of this, of what's going to happen? Did they benefit and did they consent? Then, of course, there's also secondary consequence risk. So beyond just the privacy harm happening, the severity of that privacy harm, there could be secondary consequences, tangible consequences, like it takes time out of your day, it costs you money, you're embarrassed by it, there's all sorts of tangible and sometimes intangible psychological consequences that can result. So the Kaulufa method uses 4 distinct measures of severity, or 4 distinct factors going to severity. And you'll notice they're very distinct from fair privacy. This is where they start to diverge. Because this method is very data-centric, they look at the number, this is just kind of a volume aspect, the number of data subjects and the number of records. So we're trying to take apart volume. Now, I will say, fair privacy looks at volume in terms of opportunity. So how many individuals are at risk presents a greater opportunity. And because you multiply likelihood and severity, it ends up kind of meshing out at the end. So the 2 key here ones are data subject type and data sensitivity. This goes into different data subject types are going to have different sensitivity levels. So again, you're going to get that variance among populations. Are we talking about secondary use of a victim of intimate partner violence? Are we talking about secondary use of a celebrity's information? Are we talking about secondary use of just a regular average person? And then how sensitive, what type of data is it? Is it medical data, health data? Is it your favorite color? So measuring those 2 to try to determine some level of severity. NIST, again, uses a ordinal scale. Now, what they do is they then accumulate an ordinal scale based on organizational impacts. So they look at non-compliance costs, direct business costs, reputational costs, and cultural costs on a 1 to 10 scale. Add those up, and then it's a 1 to 40 or 0 to 40 scale, I guess, in terms of what the impact. So again, an organizational look. Keneal looks at tangible damages, so physical, other forms of tangible, like emotional distress, and then moral harms, which kind of goes to the non-normativity of the activity. And again, they use a 4-point scale, but for each of the harms that they presented in the initial one, they talk about, how is this, when is this negligible, when is this limited, when is this significant, and when is this maximum, trying to help guide organizations in determining that. Isabel, are there any questions so far? Okay, I assume it's because I'm rushing through this, so I apologize if you haven't taken a breather to ask a question, but feel free to. Okay, so because fair privacy is kind of my my privacy risk model that I use, I wanted to go in a little bit more detail here. So we're going to take a scene from The Wizard of Oz, which I hope has universal knowledge, and talk about what's going on here. So we break it down to threat, vulnerability, and harm. So the threat is the Wicked Witch watches, so that she is watching Dorothy and her companions in this case. The vulnerability is that Oz is visible through her crystal ball. So you can think of the crystal ball as one of her capabilities. It's a resource she has at her disposal in order to view Oz, and that makes Dorothy and her compatriots vulnerable. And then, of course, the harm here under the Soloff taxonomy is surveillance, that they are being watched or surveilled. Now, these are the breakdowns of the factors of fair privacy risk. Again, on the left side of the screen, I just repeat the threat, vulnerability, and harm for our information. Kind of at the top right is Dorothy and her compatriots are at risk, and the time period is Dorothy's trip to Oz. Now, I'll tell you. So one of the things that FAIR uses and fair privacy uses is a concept not just of likelihood, but of frequency. So a frequency over a time period, usually a year, but you can pick any time period you want to use. So the likelihood factors are up top. Violation frequency breaks down into attempt frequency and vulnerability, and then those break down into their associated components. Now, one of the interesting things about this analysis right here is we can actually use very specific numbers, whereas normally we would have some variance. We don't know how many at-risk individuals there are. We don't know how many threat actors. There's going to be some uncertainty, and so we want to use some type of probability distribution. Here we know there are exactly 4 at-risk individuals. I didn't count Toto. Hope you don't mind for leaving the dog out. Maybe dogs need privacy too, but in our estimation, we're going to look at I hesitate to say humans, but Dorothy and her companions. Now, one of the things that's interesting about surveillance is it's not a matter, the opportunity isn't every opportunity that the Wicked Witch gets to look. I mean, she could look every day. She could look every hour. She could look every minute. But the fact that Dorothy and her compatriots are in Oz, that the Wicked Witch has the crystal ball, it gives her an opportunity to observe each of them. Whether she observed them in continuous mode throughout the entire time, or she breaks it up, it is an opportunity, not a series of infinite opportunity, depending on how she splits it up. So what is her motivation? Well, Dorothy killed her sister, so she is motivated. Again, when you have multiple threat actors, you want to consider some kind of variance, or there may be some actual uncertainty in the motivation of even an individual threat actor. You would generally consider some sort of variance and have some sort of distribution, and then you would combine those distributions. But for our simple model here, and just to go through it, we're going to consider this as a single number. Now, what about capability? Again, she has the crystal ball. It appears to be able to see throughout, so that's a very good resource in her camp. So we're going to give her 100% capability. What difficulty? We haven't put anything in place. Dorothy's not hiding under an invisible cloak like Frodo did in Lord of the Rings. You know, she doesn't have any kind of impediments to prevent her from being seen or her compatriots. So 0% difficulty. So this you end up multiplying these all through. So the violation frequency during Dorothy's trip is going to be 4. So in other words, all 4 individuals are going to get surveilled during this trip. Okay, so what about the severity? How do we look at that? So if you remember, I talked about severity of violation in terms of awareness, benefit, and consent. You know, is Dorothy and her compatriots aware that they're being watched? Not that I am familiar with, not from watching the movie. Do they benefit from the Wicked Witch of the West watching? No. Did they consent to it? Absolutely not. Now, if we were to broaden this and say that the threat actors were witches, and we included Glinda the Good Witch, then potentially they could benefit, because Glinda actually watches them, and when she sees them in the poppy field, she makes it snow in order to revive them. And so there would be, again, a variance between the different threat actors and what they would end up doing in surveilling Dorothy. One is bad for Dorothy and her compatriots, one is good. So, then the risk would lie somewhere in the middle. But at least if we're only focused, and this is why it's important to scope your privacy risk model, if we're only focused on the Wicked Witch of the West, then the severity is pretty much at the maximum. No awareness, no benefit, and consent. Oh, sorry, and I did have a picture of Dorothy in the poppy fields and Glinda the Good Witch. Um, so now, here's the interesting thing. So there is no one scale to use. I offer a couple of different scales. You can do a binary 0 or 1. Does this threat or does this harm meet the threshold of non-normativity that we would say it is in fact a privacy violation, or is it not? In other words, a 0. You could measure it as on a spectrum of 0 to 1. Not every surveillance is as bad. Again, if we were including Glinda the Good Witch, we would say, yeah, surveillance is kind of bad, but it's for their benefit. So maybe it's somewhere in the middle. So maybe we rate that a 0.5. It's not a 0, but it's certainly not as bad as the Wicked Witch of the West. Or you could use an unbounded scale that starts at 0 and goes up under the potential recognition that something could always be worse. There's always some worse privacy harm than what you've offered here, whatever that may be. But for our purposes, we will just consider it a quote unquote maximum privacy harm, or at least the severity of this surveillance. So now let's look at secondary risk. Now, these aren't usually the factors that I use in looking at secondary risk. I'm usually looking at psychological factors, loss of opportunities, loss of liberty, lost financial cost. But for this particular model, I looked at, are they delayed in their mission? Are they burned? Are they rusted? Are they scared? And I put in, so delayed is clearly a time, so we're going to measure that over time, and they all get delayed about an hour. And we're using empirical evidence from the movie to guide us. Now, is this the best way to do it? We're only given one simulation here of one movie. There could be another simulation where they're delayed multiple hours or not delayed at all. So really, again, you want to look at potential variances and ranges and what is the most likely. But for our simple example here, we're just going to use the information from the movie. Are they burned? So the scarecrow gets a little singed. The Dorothy and the lion have a potential to get burned. They're both flammable in essence. They don't actually get burned in the movie, but they have some potential for being burned there. Rusted, that's the 10 man. He gets rusted, not completely, but enough to immobilize him. And then are they scared? Well, the cowardly lion is potentially the most scared by this activity as a result. And the scarecrow is somewhat scared, hence his name, Scarecrow. Dorothy is not scared at all, and neither does the 10 man seem to be affected by this emotion. But anyway, this points out that you can develop a profile of your at-risk population and try to determine some of the potential secondary consequences as a result. And I just summarized, again, condensing our population into a single number or a range for burned and scared. So frequency, everybody's delayed, 75% of them are potentially burned, 25% are rusted, only 50% of them are scared. And then what is the range of their magnitude of those secondary consequences? Okay, so great, we've got this number. What can we do with it? What do we do with it at this point? Now, like I said, one of the potential items here is to measure risk and compare it to your organization's tolerance. So we have, and the variance in the curve represents the different simulations. Now, I will tell you, the more simulations that you do, the curve tends to smooth out. This was done on some other risk assessment I did based and using Excel. It does 2,700 calculations, which in the few thousand range simulations is usually enough to tease out a curve. Really, to get a nice smooth curve, you'd want to do 10,000 or more. But again, the limitations of Excel make that difficult. Similar with tolerance for this particular exercise that I did, I went and interviewed an organization to determine what their tolerance was for whatever the particular risk we were addressing. And as you can see, they determined that their risk was higher than their tolerance. Couple of actions they could take at this point. They could say, you know what, we need to up our tolerance. We can't do anything about the risk, so either we need to accept it or we need to drop this project. Or we can start putting in controls to reduce our risk, and that's ultimately what they ended up doing. Now, I don't show a slide, but you could also, as I mentioned, use it to prioritize your risk. So you've got two different risk curves. One is higher than the other, and you could say, okay, we need to address this risk first. And then if we still have time and resources, then we can address the other risk. Okay. Whew. I need a sip of water. Thank you, folks. I hope that wasn't too fast for everybody.